Well, thank you, Manon. And it's always a great joy to be on the One Meditation Day. I guess I've been on about 4 or 5, or maybe more. And so you're already pretty deep in, I hope, after meditating together. And Manon told me that the theme of the day is letting go of seeking, which is really one of the themes I'm most interested in, fascinated by. It's so simple, and yet it's always so new every time we explore it together. And so what I thought I would like to offer today is, instead of giving a guided meditation, which is what I usually do, is to read a couple of chapters to you all from my book, called The Fire of the Heart. And so I'm going to read you chapters 3 and 4, just to give a bit of context. The first chapter is called The Great Search, and it's really introducing the whole matter of seeking for happiness and for freedom and fulfillment, and how that urge or impulse to seek happiness and fulfillment outside ourselves, in objects, relationships and activities, it's really the driving force of the human condition. And it's really the whole world as we know it, the world, the human created world, is an externalization of that consciousness. So as Krishnamurti said, you are the world, we are the world. So the world see all its maddening complexity and craziness and needless suffering. And not to say, of course, there's a lot of very beautiful, positive things going on as well. But, of course, the weight of human ignorance and suffering is really a direct product of the consciousness of most human beings, anyway. And so one way to look at the whole journey of awakening is about transcending that great search and finding what's really true, what's really real. So just wanted to mention that, because in the chapters I'm going to read to you, I think the great search is referred to on a few occasions. Okay, so as I read, you can either just listen with your eyes open, or if you feel like you're already deep in a meditative posture and state, you can just close your eyes, let it wash over you. Okay. So this chapter is called Crossroads. When we get to the point where we can no longer bear to maintain and feed the illusion of a mediocre and basically unhappy life that is contributing to our individual and collective suffering and insanity, then we come upon a fundamental sense of disillusionment. We may begin to profoundly feel the emptiness in getting what we want, to the degree that even when we get what we think we want, we may experience a subtle dissatisfaction. More poignantly, we may even experience the arising of desire as a kind of quiet agony, a nagging dis-ease that we long to be relieved of. When we acquire the object, relationship, or activity that we think we need and want, we increasingly find that its promise is empty, and our usual satisfaction is short-lived. The existential questions, so what? Or now what? Or what is the point of it all? may increasingly arise in the midst of our temporary experience of satiation and our growing disillusionment with the momentum of seeking. Many of us penetrate into this existential crossroads of fundamental disillusionment at some point in our lives. It is often the catalyst for what is commonly known as the midlife crisis. And more people in their 20s and 30s these days are recognizing that what they have been told and sold by mainstream culture is not fulfilling them. But unfortunately, because of Western culture's pathological addiction to the perpetual fantasy of future fulfillment, such a crisis is usually viewed in a negative light. Indeed, if we are not captivated and compelled by the promises of money, power, sex, and romance, then we and others may presume that there must be something wrong with us. However, as alone and insecure as we might feel as this disillusionment begins to dawn, allowing ourselves to confront this root sense of despair is a true and necessary response to the unhappy human condition in which we find ourselves. If we are willing to bear and feel into this existential emptiness with an open and courageous heart, we will eventually come upon a clear-eyed clarity and acknowledgement of the hard truth of conditional existence and of our own mortality. We will begin to see clearly that we pursue every kind of pleasure, consolation, and distraction so that we can experience some temporary relief from our pain of basic discontent. And that in doing so, we desensitize ourselves to the stark reality of the situation we are in. That stark reality is that the ultimate happiness, peace, freedom, and fulfillment that we seek cannot be found in any of the objects, activities, and relationships that conditional existence provides. Why? Because everything, relationship, activity, and state of mind that can be experienced by the body-mind complex in this world, no matter how pleasurable, no matter how sublime, no matter how consistent, is impermanent. Think about it. Everything, gross or subtle, that arises eventually ceases. Everything that is born is destined to die. Nothing that we can acquire in this realm of conditional experience will last. We do not want to experience loss, sorrow, and separation. We do not want to suffer, and yet all of these conditions are unavoidable. Only if we are ready and willing to let this sobering truth deeply penetrate through the persistent patterning of the great search will we finally hit the rock bottom reckoning with the devastating truth that the promise of finding true happiness, true peace, true freedom, and true fulfillment in this world is quite simply a very pervasive and insidious illusion. The stark reality of our situation is that no matter how relatively happy we may manage to become through acquiring what we desire in life, everything changes and we are bound to die. When we have the courage to face into this stark truth of impermanence and the inevitability of our own death, then we will see that no matter how good our life could possibly get in the experiential realms of body, mind, and world, we are going to die and we are going to lose everything. Everything that we have possessed, known, achieved, and experienced. And everyone and everything that we love will be stripped away from us with the death of our individual body. If we are utterly convinced that all that we are is this individual body that was born at a particular time, then coming upon this fundamental disillusionment will cause us to crash. We will become emotionally depressed or cynically hardened in the face of what we now perceive to be a futile existence. We will then attempt to cover up that unbearable despair with addictive pleasures of various kinds, even though those pleasures become gradually less pleasurable, so that we can continue to live out the routines of our conventional or known script in this world. This reaction of recoil in the face of existential disillusionment could be called negative despair. And this malaise of negative despair is very common, especially in the most developed Western countries, in which alarming numbers of the population are increasingly addicted to various kinds of antidepressants, intoxicants, and the endlessly distracting omnipresence of electronic media. Nihilistic despair, corrosive cynicism, and chronic depression are ironically the most endemic in cultures in which the potential for the individual to fulfill his or her personal desires has reached its apex. Because the orientation of Western consumer culture, which has by now colonized almost the entire known world, is built upon the endless fantasy of future fulfillment of the individual, death is the greatest taboo. Conventional religion tends to console those who still hold to traditional values by inventing a spiritualized future after bodily death, in which all the things most valued in life are somehow eternalized in heaven. On the other hand, the godless modern zeitgeist of scientific materialism is driven by the conviction that the exponentially increasing rates of technological progress in computing, artificial intelligence, robotics, nanotech, and biological engineering, etc., is leading to a paradigm shift in our fundamental state of existence. And this shift would also include the ability to radically extend our lifespans so that we will have infinitely more time on Earth to enjoy these new capacities. This is what Ray Kurzweil, Google's chief technology officer, has dubbed the singularity, positing that there is a very good chance that these developments are all going to come together all at once to catalyze a monumental tipping point that will herald the advent of a brave new world of human evolution by unimaginable orders of magnitude. If he is right, Kurzweil and his fellow transhumanists believe that this will be the best news in human history. But in the East, they have always been more realistic about the inherent ephemeral nature of conditioned existence. Death is acknowledged and not hidden away. The first time I actually saw a dead body was in India when I was 24 years old. I was sitting by the burning ghats in Varanasi on the banks of the Ganges, which is one of the most auspicious places for a Hindu to be cremated. I was completely mesmerized by the sight of one funeral procession after another, accompanied by drums and the blowing of conch shells, arriving on the scene with a corpse garlanded in beautiful flowers that would then be cremated on the open fire. It was extraordinary to witness how death was so celebrated and openly exposed in Indian culture, as the smell of burning flesh wafted by in the breeze. There was a deep shock of recognition that here I was, a grown adult, who had never been confronted with the most fundamental fact of existence. That fact being that my existence will end in death. Death is hidden away in Western culture for very good reason, because death confronts us with the ultimate meaninglessness of the great search for happiness and fulfillment in the realm of conditional existence. Death is the obliteration of the subjective source of all meaning, our separate personal I. When we deeply, not just intellectually, recognize that the desires of this I that we identify with as this body-mind are never going to be fulfilled, and indeed can never be fulfilled in any ultimate sense, then we may come upon a truly positive despair or disillusionment. Positive because instead of causing us to contract in upon our separate selves in horror, we may find ourselves breathing a deep sigh of relief as we open out into an intuitive knowing that transcends the bounds of our mortal embodiment. A magnetic stillness, a sense of coming to rest, a mysterious freedom from our previously unquestioned presumption that we are only a mortal body now, forever destined to suffer in the cycles of seeking, may quietly begin to dawn. Navigating this crossroads of positive disillusionment often generates great upheaval, and our life circumstances may change dramatically as a result. We may find ourselves ending a long-term relationship, marriage, or job, or moving to another place, because we now see and feel ourselves to be trapped and stifled by those circumstances. Or, while there may be a lot of inner turmoil, the current pattern of our relationships and responsibilities in our day-to-day life may not be so outwardly impacted. But in either case, a subtle yet profoundly pervasive shift occurs in our orientation to life as a whole. The compulsive drive to seek for happiness and fulfillment in the conventional field of possibilities by constantly projecting our energy and attention outward begins to diminish. The flickering allure of consumer culture loses its power to entice us. We tire of social expectations to conform, to compete, to make it, to look sexy, and to be somebody in this world. The narratives and values of traditional religion, scientific materialism, and modern rationalism no longer satisfy us. Humility begins to soften us as we let in the truth that despite being intelligent, apparently mature, sensitive, and independent adults, we do not yet know who we really are or why we are really here. We allow ourselves to feel into our existential bewilderment and make friends with the inherent insecurity of life, as so many of the narratives, values, and self-images that we have absorbed from our parents, teachers, and cultural background begin to buckle and break as we cross the threshold into the fresh, new, and unknown adventure of spiritual awakening. In the midst of this transition, it is very common to feel like an outsider, adrift in a world that no longer makes sense. We no longer fit in to the prevailing current of cultural norms, narratives, and social expectations. Indeed, traversing this crossroads is usually a very insecure and disconcerting rite of passage that may last for several months or even many years. As we free ourselves from the consensus matrix of the great search, a still, sober aloneness begins to emerge within us. And often, along with that, comes the intermittent fear and even terror of losing everything that was once held so dear. our cozy relationships, shared values, and material comfort. For some, the fear and disorientation of being swept out into uncharted waters is simply too much to bear. And so they find a way to compromise their spiritual longing by falling back into patterns of living and relating with a comfortable, safe unknown. But if a life of mediocrity is no longer an option for us, then we will feel a rising intuitive certainty in our hearts that there can be no turning back. We will feel the thrilling tug of a presence beyond our comprehension that pulls us forward, no matter how insecure it may make us feel. When the hard truth of positive disillusionment has taken root, and we feel spontaneously moved toward the principle of freedom from the conditioned pattern of mortal existence, then the awakening process has irrevocably begun. And then there can be no turning back. Next chapter is called The Fly on the Window. Once we have awakened to the futility of mankind's great search and have intuitively recognized what Gautama Buddha meant when he declared the principle, life is suffering, to be the foundation of his teaching, we consciously begin to turn away from the conflicted cycle of seeking for our fulfillment in material and psychological terms. We usually then begin to identify ourselves on some level as now being a spiritual seeker. And this initiates our entrance into what we could call the second great search. The first great search being the conventional search for happiness in the gross material domain of conditional existence. The second great search is the search for spiritual or ultimate fulfillment, which is commonly referred to as enlightenment in the Eastern spiritual traditions, or salvation in the Middle Eastern monotheistic religions spread throughout the West. This second great search is usually conceived as a turning away from the material, vital, and mortal world of earth and life toward an inward search for the metaphysical, subtle, and spiritual world of heaven or light. When most spiritual seekers sit down to meditate, to pray, or enact any spiritual practice, they tend to start from a presumption of themselves as an unenlightened, limited, and contracted ego-I, or sinner, who is then going to attempt to invert and project the urge to spiritual or ultimate liberation toward the higher, subtle potentials of heaven and light. This is usually done via various techniques and methodologies. In other words, instead of directing attention downwards and outwards toward the conventional objects of the first great search into the earthly vital realm of life, they are now directing attention inwards and upwards toward the heavenly realm of life. Instead of seeking worldly experience, they are now seeking spiritual experience, and to enter into some kind of alternative transcendental reality beyond the realms of the body and mind. This orientation is almost inevitable and very understandable in the early stages of the spiritual path, until a more mature understanding and orientation can replace it. However, this immature orientation tends to persist in many Western spiritual seekers because we are so culturally conditioned to be consumers of experience. Chogyam Trungpa, a controversial Tibetan master, who pioneered the seeding of the Buddha Dharma in the West, called this syndrome spiritual materialism. And he wrote an excellent book called Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism that I highly recommend. If you want to get a sense of this in yourself, it is a basic disposition in relationship to the spiritual path that seeks relief and consolation in accumulating psychic or mystical experience, and also seeks to develop a self-consciously spiritual identity. If your orientation to spirituality consists of desires like the following: I want to feel better, to feel peaceful and blissful all the time. I want to escape from the complexity of bodily, emotional, and mental life. And if you find yourself attracted to adorning your body or home with spiritual paraphernalia, then all of this indicates that your longing for liberation carries the taint of spiritual materialism. Once we have embarked upon the second great search in earnest, instead of seeking happiness, fulfillment, and freedom through the acquisition of objects, relationships, and activities, we now seek happiness, fulfillment, and freedom through the acquisition of higher states of consciousness. And especially in the postmodern, alternative, East meets West spiritual marketplace, there is now a veritable smorgasbord of spiritual methodologies and technologies available that, if pursued, will indeed generate often remarkable and deeply liberating higher states of consciousness. Assuming that we have enough passion and persistence, and perhaps are willing to spend the money, it is not so difficult these days to experience higher or extraordinary states of consciousness by practicing yoga, pranayama, rebirthing, shamanism, tantras and mantras, etc. However, whatever goes up has to come down, and heaven cannot be taken by storm. Higher states, or what are often called peak experiences, can indeed give us a peek or glimpse of what is possible, but all experiential states must, by definition, eventually fade, because, as I mentioned before, all experiences, including states of consciousness, are impermanent. This is why so many spiritual seekers remain spiritual seekers for their entire life, addicted to the fleeting ecstatic highs and incandescent lights of subtle and mystical experience. They are perpetually in the grip of the patterning of the second great search. It is the second great search that wants to acquire spiritual enlightenment or salvation. Thus, they are constantly compelled to keep seeking for the ever-elusive, magical enlightenment bullet that they think is going to propel them into a never-ending experience of bliss and love and light. However, as embedded as our tendency to be consumers is in our Western psyches, if we are sincere in our aspiration for awakening and sensitive to the positive disillusionment that underlies all seeking, at some point we will recognize that the ultimate happiness, peace, freedom, and fulfillment that we seek can only be discovered by letting go of seeking completely. An amusing metaphor that often comes to mind to explain this is that of a fly desperately buzzing and banging its head over and over again on the window through which it sees the light. It excitedly traverses the window by buzzing upwards, downwards, sideways, in every possible direction. It rests for a while and then starts again, always finding itself frustrated by the beckoning of the light that seems closer than close, yet forever out of reach. At some point, completely exhausted from its ferocious buzzing and its repeatedly bashing its head against the glass, the fly finally gives up trying to penetrate through the window to the light beyond and is then spontaneously overtaken by a mysterious out-of-the-box impulse. Letting go of the tension of seeking the light, it relaxes its linear approach and then unexpectedly discovers an open window or door nearby and buzzes effortlessly out into the light of freedom. In this metaphor, the window obviously represents the seeking mind, through which enlightenment or awakening is usually pursued. And the open window or door represents the possibility of freedom that is always already the case, but can only be apprehended when we truly let go of all seeking. All the true spiritual teachings and teachers tell us that true happiness, peace, freedom, and fulfillment are closer than close, right in front of our noses. And yet we cannot get there from here. As long as we presume that our separation from the light is already the case, then we will be forever banging our head on the window, trying to get there. When we finally give up and let go of all seeking, after having exhausted all our efforts and strategies, in that still, silent dawning, however it occurs, we become sensitized to a deep intuition of innate happiness, peace, and freedom that is not dependent on the attainment of any object or experience. This intuition tells us that our natural state is already happy, free, and at peace, and that whatever is natural to us must be with us always.